Everybody. This is Wes from 180 and the Jacksonville Baptist Association. I just wanted to jump on here and record some quick Zoom meeting tutorials to basically show you some of the best ways to use Zoom for churches. I know everyone's probably familiar with the platform already. You probably have had some meetings on it. If not, you've probably heard people talking about it. But you can go to zoom.us and download and create an account. But what I wanted to do to kind of start out is help people understand the difference between the basic free account and the pro account. Now, I have a pro account, and I'll explain why that is here in just a few minutes. But basically, if you're mostly attending meetings, you're not the one scheduling meetings, then a free account is more than sufficient for what you would need. If you are scheduling meetings and you're scheduling group meetings that need to be longer than 40 minutes, then you probably want to go ahead and upgrade to the pro account. So just to kind of break down the difference between these two, with a basic free account, you can host up to 100 participants, which is plenty. All of your one-on-one meetings, so one host and one participant, just two people in the meeting total, those can last unlimited. So they last, there's no time limit on those. But if you're in a group meeting where there's 3 or more people, that meeting will be limited to 40 minutes. So that's important to know. So if you're having even just 30-minute meetings, you can do group meetings just fine with a free account. That's not a problem. But if you need to host more, your meetings need to be longer than 40 minutes, then you're going to need to upgrade here to the pro account for $14.99. And really for what you get, it's really not that bad. The price point there is pretty good. Now to kind of explain what the difference is here, if you are a pro account, which I have, you can have, again, 100 participants. Your meeting duration total, that means any meeting that you have, the duration is 24 hours, which no one's really going to have a meeting longer than 24 hours. You may have it for a few hours, but definitely not 24. You also get the ability to be able to add users and kind of have some control and have multiple users under one main account. You have some additional admin features and things like that, but really it even comes with 1 gigabyte of cloud storage, which really honestly is not enough to really even record very much on there. You may get 1 or 2 recordings on 1 gigabyte of cloud recording. So it doesn't really matter, but when you get into recording, I'll kind of walk through kind of best practices for that. So I have a pro account. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and go up here and log into my account. And what I want to do is explain some of the settings, some of the initial settings that you need to change. I'm associated mine with my personal or my work Gmail account. Once you log in, you'll see I already have some scheduled meetings here, some youth Zoom calls for our church, small group Bible study that I have on Tuesday nights, a book club that my wife is part of. So there's different meetings that I already have scheduled. So you'll see some of those in there. But what I want to do is talk about some of the basic settings you probably need to know about and change right after you create your account. So we're going to go here to user management. Go down to account management. And then we're going to go to account settings. And here's basically a list of all the meeting settings that you can put together. And for the most part, there's some in here that you may or may not want to set as default. So this is basically where you go to set your default meeting settings. So just kind of run through these. Like this first one here is the host video. So if you're hosting a meeting, do you want your video on by default? If so, then you can select that and check that box there and turn it on. Now, I don't like to leave that on because I kind of like to enter a meeting without my video being on, and then I like to start my video when I'm ready to. So I usually leave that off, and I do the same thing for my participants and allow them to start their video when they're ready to be seen on there. Now, the audio type here, one really cool thing that you can do with Zoom is that you can actually join through a phone number. So when you schedule a meeting, you actually have the ability to be able to send people the phone number, and they can enter the meeting ID and join just over like a regular telephone call. So here you can automatically allow whether just computer audio, so only really people on a computer can join the meeting, or even the people with just telephone or telephone and computer audio. I just basically defaulted to this in case I were ever have anybody who needed to join by telephone. Now, this is an interesting thing here in kind of in the modern era where we have Zoom bombing and things like this. This is kind of some security things that are important to know. Right here, it has join before host. Allow participants to join the meeting before the host arrives. Most of the time, it used to be where this was default, and people could join the meetings even before you, the host, got into the meeting. You want to leave this off so that no one can really go into the meeting, post anything, kind of share anything before you get in there, to make sure that they're not doing anything that you don't want them to do. So I just kind of suggest leaving that off right there. So everyone who typically won't be able to get into the meeting, or as we get a little bit further down, they'll be put into what's called a waiting room, which will enable them to kind of sit there on hold until you admit them into the meeting. So to go down a little bit further here, we have enable personal meeting ID, which is basically allows you and gives you a static 9 to 11 digit number, which is assigned to you. So when you go to create just real quick meetings, you can kind of use the same meeting ID over and over and over again. Now, I do this with some of my meetings, but not with the ones that I schedule. And I'll kind of get into that just a little bit later. Now, right here, require a password for personal meeting ID. That if you want them, I'm just going to go ahead and suggest that you use a password for just about all of the meetings that you do. In this world where we have people invading other people's meetings, typically you want to have some sort of password on your meeting. Luckily, Zoom has started to do that by default now, where it used to not require that. Just to kind of help beef up security, they've started doing that for some of those things. Now, right here is another interesting, you might wonder what this says, only authenticated users can join meetings. Well, what that means is basically only people who have an account. So they've created an account with Zoom. I leave this off because sometimes, we're having Bible studies and people haven't created a Zoom account. They're really just clicking on the link to join a meeting. So for most church activities, I would just leave that off. And these are some other options here. Most of these don't really have anything to do when you're kind of creating that, so you don't have to worry about that so much. But right here it says require a password when scheduling new meetings. Right now I have this off, but I typically like to keep this on. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this back on for my account so that every new meeting I schedule will automatically have a password. And then require passwords for instant meetings. Now these I typically will leave off because if I'm going to create a meeting, and I'll explain the difference between a scheduled meeting and an instant meeting in just a second. But I will leave this on because typically I'm doing this kind of on a one-on-one. I'm using instant meetings for not things that are planned that I'm inviting a lot of people to, but rather just to have quick meetings with colleagues or clients or other people in our church. So I typically will leave that off so that they don't have to enter a password because I'm not really too concerned with security when it comes to that. Now I can scroll on down here, require password for participants joining by phone. If someone were to get your phone number and, having them be able to join your meeting by phone without really requiring a password, I typically would just leave this on just to kind of have some added security. Right here, mute participants upon entry. So when they join a meeting, their microphone is turned on or off. Now, depending on who you have with the meeting, whether they're tech savvy enough to know how to turn on their microphone or the type of meeting that you're having. Maybe you don't want them to be able to talk right away. You want them to stay muted when they get into the meeting. So you can either toggle that on and off. Another great thing that Zoom does is it integrates with different calendar services like Google or Outlook or Exchange or other email services. Even I believe it does with iCal as well. So what you could do here is enable this, and if you schedule a meeting, it will show up on your calendar. Now, I use a lot of Google products and services, so I have it integrated with my Google account. So anytime I create a meeting with Zoom or schedule a meeting with Zoom, it will show up in my Google Calendar, which is super helpful. So I'll go ahead and scroll on down here. Some other options right here. You can enable the chat function by default. This is a great thing to have in meetings because sometimes you can ask a question and have people respond in the chat versus having them unmute their mic and allowing them to talk. If you're just asking a simple question, you can go ahead and have them just tell the people in the meeting, hey, respond to this in the chat. Let me know how you feel about this, or asking questions. So it's a great way to do this. Now, this private chat allows people in your meeting to be able to send a message to another person in your meeting. It's private. No one else can see that. depending on the type of meeting that you're having, that may be a useful feature where maybe two people need to kind of have a conversations that's not quite as public. There's other ways you could do this as well. I mean, you could obviously just text someone if you knew them and you wanted to have a private conversation. I will leave this on just as sometimes my clients, or if I'm having a large group meeting, sometimes people might want to use that. Some other things right here: file transfer. You can set this up so your hosts and participants can send files through the in-meeting chat. Now, I will typically leave this default because I don't really like people sharing files that I don't have any control over in my meeting, so I will leave that off. Another great thing to be able to use here is this co-host. So co-host, I usually will enable that by default because it enables me to, after I get the meeting started, there's a bunch of people, maybe for some reason as the host I have to leave early. I can go in there and select someone else to be the host of that meeting, and they have all the controls that I had to be able to end the meeting or mute people or unmute people, or even remove people or stop their video. Sometimes it's helpful to have someone else in there. Now, that doesn't mean that they're the host and you're not. You can go ahead and then give someone host privileges even if you still are in the meeting, which is good, especially if you have several people that you trust in there. If you're having some sort of waiting room, you might want to enable this as a co-host, or enable someone that you trust as a co-host to be able to sit there and allow people into the meeting as you're kind of leading the meeting. Another thing, if you're interested in trying to do something like this, so you can have polls where you can send polls and survey your attendees or the people that are in there. So I'll use that as an option. One of the great powers of Zoom is screen sharing. And you can screen share your computer. You can screen share an iPad or an iPhone. There's even a really cool little whiteboard where you can kind of draw and doodle on that. But basically, by default, I'd usually leave that on. And who can share this? Well, who can share, kind of depending on what type of meeting you're having. Maybe you are the only one who can share your screen. Or you can allow all participants to share their screen, kind of depending on the meeting. And this is something you actually can change in your meeting. So even by a lot of these things that I'm talking through here are things that you can change with your meeting after it gets going, especially this one right here. Kind of as a security precaution, who can start sharing when someone else is sharing. I usually will leave that as host only because I don't want anyone else sharing on top of someone else. Or if someone else is sharing something that I don't want them to share, I can turn that off, stop that, and host over top of them if I need to. The whiteboard is this little thing that you can go on there and share and doodle with that. And that's a great thing to be able to do if you need to kind of draw something out. And the rest of this really isn't anything too major. One interesting thing right here where you can allow participants to rename themselves. So maybe you're using someone else's account and you want to kind of want to be able to change your name to represent your church or your business. So if you're hosting a meeting with a lot of different people who may want to have that ability, then check that right there. But if you want people to only be known by the name that they've registered by, then you want to uncheck that so that they don't have the ability to be able to rename themselves and maybe potentially pretend like they're someone that they're really not. The breakout room is a really neat feature that you can use to take your group and divide them up into smaller rooms, where if you had a group of 10 people, you could divide them up into 2 separate meetings with 5 people in each, or however you wanted to break that up. So sometimes that can be a helpful feature if you need to have the ability to be able to do that or need to do that. You can check that right there. So with that said, if you have a powerful enough computer, you can do something called a virtual background, which enables your camera. So if you have a camera that is compatible as well as a computer that's powerful enough, it can kind of isolate you, the host, from your background, the thing behind you on the camera, and you can insert different pictures and things to be able to kind of give yourself a virtual background there. Other than that, though, that's kind of the main things that you're going to want to enable when you set up your account. One last thing, and this is probably very important, is setting up this waiting room right here. Zoom has gone and made this default for all meetings now, and it's probably a good security practice to basically enable someone as the host. You have to allow them into your meeting. Now, you have to pay attention to the chat and to the manage participants screen, which I'll show you when we get into the meeting. But you'll want to make sure that this is probably enabled for most of your meetings, and then allow people to come in there. This also allows you to to make sure that you know everyone who's in your meeting, and therefore you trust them that they're not going to do anything inappropriate. So right here it says choose which participants to place in the waiting room. Now you can choose by default, I believe it's all participants. So even the ones that are registered will be put into the waiting room. And that's a good standard practice. I just would say leave it that way. If it is something a reoccurring with the same group and they just kind of get aggravated with not being allowed into the meeting, you can click guest participants only, which guest participants are those who do not have an account. So there's no way to know exactly who that person is. So that only those people who do not have a Zoom account would be put in the waiting room. All right. The last few things down here as far as some notifications or cloud recording. And most of the time when you record, I'm going to suggest that you record not in the cloud. Sometimes it's an option. Maybe if you're on a slower computer and you just need the ability to be able to record something, that is great. If you have a powerful enough computer to host the meeting, typically it's powerful enough to record the meeting locally. I like to have those files on hand, not depend on Zoom or their cloud storage to be able to handle those. So I typically will leave this on, but when I do record meetings, I will usually record to my computer. Now, with that being said, we've kind of got our account set up. So hopefully whether you've got a free account or a pro account, you've created that, you've signed in, you've set some of your kind of meeting defaults through the account settings screen, and you'll be set up to kind of host and be able to run Zoom meetings well. Now, the next video that we'll do, we'll actually start meetings and show you how to start instant meetings and schedule meetings and all sorts of those things. So we'll see you then.